Imagine the moment when hidden truths finally break into the open. Live on air, with cameras rolling and no chance to edit, a former Daystar employee steps forward to reveal shocking details about Joanie Lamb that viewers never expected to hear. Gasps ripple through the audience as secrets long buried come to light in real time. This isn't rumor or speculation. It's a bold, raw exposé that leaves everyone stunned and desperate to know what will be revealed next. For years, Daystar stood as a shining name in Christian broadcasting. People tuned in, believing they were part of something pure, something rooted in faith and hope. The hosts spoke with confidence, the programs carried messages of love, and for many, Daystar felt like a safe place to turn when life grew heavy. At the center of it all was Joni Lamb, a familiar face that audiences trusted. She was seen as strong, faithful, and devoted to her mission. But behind the polished image, according to a former employee, there was a side of Daystar that the public was never meant to see. The revelation came live on television, raw and unfiltered. Sitting under the bright studio lights, this ex-employee decided it was time to tell the truth. What they described was not the image of a caring, faith-filled network, but something far darker. They spoke about a hidden culture where fear ruled the halls, where silence was rewarded, and where asking the wrong question could end a career. The Daystar the viewers thought they knew, the one filled with prayer and promises, was not the Daystar employees lived in every day. The whistleblower described how the network was less about ministry and more about control. People were reminded constantly of who held the power, and that speaking out against leadership wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. According to them, the smiles on camera and the messages of hope were like a mask, carefully placed to hide what was really going on behind closed doors. For many, this revelation was heartbreaking. To hear that an organization that spoke about God's love might also be a place of intimidation and manipulation was shocking. Viewers who had once trusted Daystar began to wonder what was real and what was simply a performance for the cameras. The former employee's words painted a picture of a world that felt more like a battlefield than a ministry. One where loyalty to the leadership mattered more than truth or compassion. This moment of exposure cracked open the perfect image Daystar had built over decades. It left people asking hard questions. What else don't we know? How deep does this culture run? And how much of what we believed was never true to begin with? When the former employee began to describe what life was really like inside Daystar, it wasn't just about strict rules or difficult bosses. What they shared felt heavier, darker, like a system carefully designed to break people down. It wasn't enough for the leadership to fire someone or quietly push them out of the organization. According to the whistleblower, Daystar had a way of making sure everyone understood what happened to those who dared to question authority. They used fear as a weapon and humiliation as their favorite tool.
They do the semi-annual telethon there. I think they call it Heart for the World now. There's a room there just full of phones and cubicles and several hundred people in there that just answer phones all day. And the prayer department was in charge of taking the calls during the telethon when people would call in to donate. But every once in a while, the call volume would be so high that all company employees would be required to be on standby on their phone. And so this was one of those particular occasions. The call volume was exceptionally high. And lo and behold, my phone rang. I answer it, and it's this sweet little elderly lady, and she's weeping, and she's telling me that she's completely in debt. She has nothing, no money, but she does have a last little bit on her credit card, and she's going to give that to Daystar because the person on air said that if you give $1,000 today, God is going to give you $10,000 back.
The stories began with small examples, moments that might sound harmless at first, but carried a clear message. Employees who disagreed with a decision or asked too many questions would suddenly find themselves reassigned to the most menial jobs. Imagine someone working in a leadership role, someone who had experience and respect, suddenly being told to clean bathrooms or file endless stacks of papers. It wasn't about the job itself, it was about control. It was about showing the entire staff what could happen if you didn't fall in line. The whistleblower explained that these punishments were rarely private. If someone was being disciplined, the leadership made sure others knew about it. They wanted the humiliation to be seen, to be talked about, to spread like a warning. Employees would whisper about the person who had been demoted or forced into a degrading task, and that whispering created more fear. No one wanted to be the next example. And it wasn't only about reassignment. Sometimes, according to the former worker, the humiliation was public and direct. Staff meetings could turn into arenas where a single employee was singled out, criticized, or even mocked in front of their peers. Jokes would be made at their expense, and the laughter of others, whether genuine or nervous, would drive the message deeper. You didn't cross the leadership. You didn't question the system. If you did, you'd be made to feel small, worthless, and completely powerless. The whistleblower recalled moments where people left meetings in tears, unable to face their coworkers. Some would hide in bathrooms to cry, terrified that showing weakness would only make things worse. Others became quiet, withdrawn, doing everything they could to stay invisible. Over time, the constant threat of being shamed broke people down. Even the strongest voices grew silent, and the culture of fear tightened its grip. What made this even more painful, the whistleblower said, was the contradiction. On camera, Daystar promoted messages of faith, encouragement, and family. They spoke about kindness and love. But, behind closed doors, those values seemed forgotten. Instead, intimidation became the currency of power. Leadership wanted obedience, and they were willing to crush anyone's spirit to get it. And the tactics didn't end when someone left the building. If an employee decided they couldn't take it anymore and walked away, the humiliation often followed them. Former workers found themselves the subject of rumors spread through the community. Lies about their character, their faith, or their work ethic were whispered to others in the industry. The whistleblower claimed it was intentional. Daystar wanted to make sure that anyone who left on bad terms was marked, unable to move forward in their career. It wasn't just about silencing dissent. It was about destroying reputations. One of the most chilling parts of the story was how calculated it all seemed. According to the testimony, this wasn't random anger or the outburst of a single leader having a bad day. It was a pattern, repeated over and over until it became normal. Employees learned quickly that the safest option was silence. They kept their heads down, avoided difficult conversations, and hoped they wouldn't be noticed. The whistleblower described how this constant fear seeped into every part of life. People stopped trusting one another, afraid that even casual conversations might be reported back to leadership. Friendships became fragile, and isolation grew. When someone was publicly humiliated, others felt relief that it wasn't them. But that relief was mixed with dread, knowing it could be their turn next. Over time, the emotional weight became unbearable. Many employees left feeling broken, ashamed, and deeply betrayed. They had joined Daystar believing they were serving God, working for a cause bigger than themselves. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an environment where humiliation was routine and fear dictated every decision. Some spoke of losing their faith altogether, unable to reconcile the teachings of love and grace with the cruelty they experienced daily. The whistleblower's voice carried a mix of sadness and anger as they described these tactics. Sadness for the people who had suffered, who had given so much of themselves only to be torn apart. Anger for the leaders who had chosen fear over compassion, control over honesty. To them, the story of Daystar wasn't just about a toxic workplace. It was about betrayal. Betrayal of trust, of faith, and of the people who believed they were part of something good. In telling their story, the whistleblower hoped to shine a light on what they called the hidden playbook of intimidation. It was a reminder that not all abuse leaves visible scars. Sometimes, it's the quiet humiliation, the whispered rumors, the public ridicule that cuts the deepest. And for many who lived through it, those wounds never fully healed. When people on the outside thought of Daystar, the face they often saw was Joni Lamb. To viewers, she was the calm, polished, and confident woman who seemed to embody everything the network claimed to stand for. She spoke about faith, family, and hope, and for many years her presence felt reassuring, almost maternal. But according to the whistleblower's testimony, this carefully built image hid something very different. They described a woman who was not just aware of the toxic culture within Daystar, but someone who actively took part in creating it. The former employee explained that Joanie wasn't simply sitting in the background while others carried out harsh decisions. She was right there, shaping the environment, making choices that directly affected people's lives, and setting the tone for how the network treated its staff. In their words, she wasn't just a figurehead or a distant leader. She was the one who decided how discipline would look, how dissent would be punished, and how employees would be reminded of their place.
I don't really have words to say how horrible I felt in that moment, that I took that card number and I ran that card, because it just felt very, very wrong. And that was really the first time that I stopped and said, do I want to be a part of this? Is this the kingdom of God? Because I don't know how you can justify that before God. I just don't. There were people there like that spoke that way, that taught that way, that really perpetuated this idea of the prosperity gospel. God's going to give you back what you give tenfold. There were just so many beautiful, innocent people who bought that hook, line, and sinker, and in desperation would call in. I just didn't want to be a part of that anymore. By the end, I was glad that I had my son's birth as an excuse to walk away.
One story that stood out involved a former senior employee who had once held a respected role at the network. After leaving Daystar under difficult circumstances, they tried to rebuild their life by taking a job at a cosmetics counter. It was honest work, far from the spotlight, and they were doing what they could to move on. But, according to the whistleblower, Joanie Lamb and her mother happened to come across this employee in the store. Instead of showing grace or even ignoring the situation, they allegedly made cruel comments in public, mocking the person for their new job. Words like, "Look at this, she went from director of marketing at Daystar to this," were said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. For the person on the receiving end, it was devastating. It wasn't just an offhand remark. It was a deliberate act of shaming, one that stripped them of dignity and reinforced the power dynamic Joni wanted everyone to recognize. The whistleblower said this wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a pattern that Joni herself maintained. While the public saw her as graceful and kind, employees described her as calculating, someone who understood the impact of humiliation and used it as a tool. Meetings, conversations, even casual interactions could become stages for her to remind people who was in charge. If someone dared to challenge her authority or question the direction of the network, they risked being singled out. What made it even harder for employees was the disconnect between what Joni preached and what she practiced. On air, she talked about compassion, forgiveness, and the love of God. Behind the scenes, she was allegedly sharp, quick to cut people down, and willing to turn private disagreements into public spectacles. That contradiction left many staff members confused and disillusioned. They wanted to believe in her message, but the reality of working under her made it almost impossible. The whistleblower described moments where Joni would deliberately use her influence to isolate employees she didn't trust. People who once had promising roles found themselves sidelined, given tasks far beneath their skills, or excluded from important meetings. These actions were subtle enough that from the outside, they might look like ordinary management decisions, but inside the network, everyone knew it was punishment. Everyone knew it came from her. And Joni didn't always act alone. Her mother, who had also been deeply involved in the growth of Daystar, was often by her side. Together, they created what the whistleblower called a circle of control. If you were in favor with them, life was easier. If you weren't, every day became a test of survival. The whistleblower explained that this dynamic made the culture even more suffocating. It wasn't just about one leader making harsh choices. It was a family influence that trickled down, shaping the entire environment. For employees who hoped things might change, there was always the same disappointment. People thought, maybe Joni doesn't know what's happening, maybe if she hears about it she'll fix it. But when those concerns eventually reached her, the opposite often happened. Instead of offering help, she allegedly used the information as fuel for further retaliation. Complaints about mistreatment didn't lead to reform. They led to the complainer being labeled as disloyal, and sooner or later, they would be humiliated too. The whistleblower remembered one particular meeting where Joni directly called out an employee for questioning a decision. She did it in front of a full room, her voice calm but cutting, making sure everyone heard. The employee sat there, red-faced and silent, while others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. No one dared to defend them. That moment, the whistleblower said, captured what it was like to work under Joni's leadership. A constant awareness that at any time, you could become the target. And for those who left the organization, Joni's involvement didn't necessarily end when their employment did. According to the whistleblower, she knew exactly how to use her connections and influence to shape the narrative around former staff. If someone was critical of the network after leaving, rumors would spread quickly. Stories would be told about their lack of faith, their instability, or their supposed dishonesty. These weren't random bits of gossip, they were deliberate messages that traveled through church communities, media circles, and beyond. And, the whistleblower insisted, Joni herself played a role in making sure those stories reached the right ears. Hearing these accounts, the image of Joni Lamb as the voice of faith took on a very different tone. The same charisma that won her the trust of millions was, in the eyes of her employees, the same weapon she used to control, intimidate, and ultimately humiliate those who dared to cross her. The whistleblower spoke with both pain and clarity, emphasizing that this wasn't a matter of one or two bad moments. It was a culture she fostered and benefited from. For employees who once looked up to her, the realization was crushing. Many had joined Daystar because they admired her. They saw her as an example of faith in action. To discover that she allegedly orchestrated so much of the mistreatment felt like betrayal on the deepest level. It wasn't just a leader being harsh. It was a leader tearing down the very people who had trusted her with their careers, their faith, and sometimes even their sense of self-worth. By sharing these stories, the whistleblower wanted people to understand that Joni Lamb wasn't simply a passive figurehead. She was at the center of it all. She had the authority, the influence, and the ability to change the culture if she had wanted to. Instead, according to these accounts, she chose to embrace it, to use humiliation and intimidation as tools of control. And for the people who worked under her, the cost was high. Broken spirits, shattered trust, and lives permanently marked by the experience. When the former employee finally found the courage to share their story, one of the hardest parts to explain wasn't just what happened inside the walls of Daystar. It was what came after. The aftermath of working in that environment didn't simply disappear once someone left the building. It lingered, like a shadow, following people into their homes, into their new jobs, and into the quiet corners of their minds, where they used to find comfort in faith. The consequences weren't only professional, they were deeply personal, shaping lives long after Daystar was behind them. For many, the first and most obvious consequence was the loss of their careers. People who had worked tirelessly, who had built experience and reputations in the world of broadcasting or ministry, suddenly found themselves blacklisted. Opportunities that once seemed possible were closed off. Phone calls weren't returned, interviews never led to offers, and in some cases, former colleagues avoided them altogether. The smear campaigns that the whistleblower described had real weight. Lies spread quickly, and reputations collapsed overnight. What hurt the most wasn't always the rejection itself, but the realization that the doors had been closed intentionally, that someone they had once trusted was making sure they couldn't move forward. The financial struggles that followed were just as brutal. Without steady work, former employees had to take whatever jobs they could find, often far below their skill level. Some went from holding respected positions to working retail counters, answering phones, or taking on temporary work just to pay the bills. While there's no shame in honest work, the contrast between where they had been and where they ended up was staggering. And when people from Daystar crossed paths with them, it wasn't unusual for whispers or cruel remarks to surface, reminding them of the humiliation that still followed. But the deeper wound was inside. Many who left spoke about the sense of betrayal that cut through their faith. They had joined Daystar believing they were serving God, that they were part of something holy and bigger than themselves. They believed the messages preached on air, the promises of hope, the talk of grace, the vision of a community built on love. To discover that behind the curtain was a culture of control, intimidation, and cruelty left them questioning not just the network, but their own beliefs. The whistleblower explained that for some, it felt like their faith had been stolen. They struggled to pray, because the words reminded them of the people who had used prayer as a cover for manipulation. They avoided churches, because the language of sermons echoed too closely the speeches they'd heard in staff meetings. Even opening a Bible became difficult for a time, because the verses that once brought comfort had been twisted and used against them in ways that now triggered pain. It wasn't just doubt, it was grief. Grief for the years they had given, the trust they had extended, and the belief that they were building something meaningful. They spoke of feeling naive, foolish for having believed the promises of leadership, ashamed that they hadn't seen the warning signs sooner. And yet, at the same time, they knew they weren't alone. Dozens of others had walked away from Daystar with the same heavy hearts, carrying the same invisible wounds. Relationships suffered too. Families who once celebrated their loved ones working in Christian broadcasting now struggled to understand why those same loved ones seemed distant, depressed, or angry. Friends outside the network couldn't grasp how deep the trauma ran, often saying things like, "Just move on," or "At least you don't work there anymore." But moving on wasn't simple. The constant fear, the humiliation, and the betrayal had rewired how people thought and felt. Trust didn't come easily, Even in safe environments, they looked over their shoulders, waiting for the same tactics of intimidation to appear again. The whistleblower described sleepless nights, waking up in a cold sweat after dreams where they were back in those rooms, facing the same leaders, hearing the same cruel words. Even after leaving, the fear clung to them. Seeing a car parked outside the house felt suspicious. A stranger's glance in public could trigger anxiety. The sense of being watched, controlled, or judged didn't vanish overnight. It had settled deep into their bones, and yet, for some, the deepest cut was spiritual. They asked themselves hard questions late at night. If this is what a Christian organization looks like, what does that mean about God? Was everything I believed a lie? Some walked away from faith entirely, unable to reconcile the cruelty they experienced with the God they had been taught to trust. Others clung to their faith, but in a wounded, cautious way, afraid of being hurt again. The sense of betrayal wasn't just directed at Joni Lamb or the network, it bled into their relationship with God himself. The whistleblower admitted that this crisis of faith was the hardest part to heal. Losing a job is painful, but eventually another job can come. Losing a reputation is devastating, but with time and resilience, it's possible to rebuild. But losing faith? Losing the core of what gave life meaning? That was a wound that didn't simply close. It lingered, reshaping everything, leaving scars that many carried for years. Still, there were moments of resilience too. Some found strength in connecting with others who had been through the same thing. Quiet conversations over coffee turned into small circles of support, where people could finally say out loud what they had endured without fear of being silenced. In those circles, they began to rebuild not just their confidence, but their sense of faith, not in the institution, but in a God who, they hoped, was bigger than the failings of leaders. For the whistleblower, speaking out publicly was part of that healing. By telling their story, they hoped to lift some of the weight from their own heart while also warning others. They wanted people to know that behind the polished image of Daystar and the smiling face of Joanie Lamb, there were real consequences. Broken families, shattered faith, and lives derailed. The testimony wasn't meant just to expose. It was meant to give voice to the pain so many had carried silently and, maybe, in some small way, begin the process of reclaiming what had been stolen. In the end, the story of the consequences wasn't just about careers or reputations. It was about the heavy, invisible cost of betrayal. It was about people who walked into Daystar full of faith and walked out questioning everything they once believed. It was about the crisis of faith that came from discovering that those who preached hope were the very ones taking it away, and for those who lived through it, the scars were more than just memories. They were reminders of how fragile trust can be and how deeply it hurts when that trust is broken.